Honestly, we cannot finish up the secondary sector and manufacturing industry without giving a little bit more to the pollution component. I know what you're thinking. Quarter, come on, pollution again? Yeah, pollution again. Let's face it, it impacts the planet. It impacts you personally in terms of your health. It impacts the health of the people that you love. So we need to examine it deeply. And manufacturing and industry, the Industrial Revolution, have played a massive role in increasing the amount of pollution we as human beings are able to make. So who produces it? Let's see. First, we're going to look at this graph. So let me blow the graph up. There we go, nice and big. Over on the left-hand side, you can see where the red arrow is, that this starts in 1850. Of course, you know the Industrial Revolution began in the 1750s in England. So 100 years passes before we start with this graph. And you can see over on the left-hand side that what's happening is there is not a lot of CO2, carbon dioxide emissions in 1850, at least compared to now. So you can imagine in the 1750s, it was even less than that. And then if you look, you can see that this red arrow is indicating from 1850 to 1950, although there were increases in CO2 emissions, the increases were not huge. It was not substantial in terms of the increase in CO2 emissions. And of course, other pollution is marching along in lockstep with CO2. This is just looking specifically at carbon dioxide. But you can see that from 1950 onwards, pollution increases significantly. Look at that red arrow and compare it to the trajectory of the previous arrow. Boom, up. Well, what happens in 1950? What begins to happen is that other places in the world beyond developed countries begin to industrialize. And of course, that's going to result in more pollution. If you take a look at that purple arrow, it's indicating that that kind of yellow-orangish color indicates developed countries on the graph, whereas the bluish color indicates everybody else, which basically means developing countries. And you can see where I've circled it, that what begins to happen? Developing countries begin to industrialize, and as a result of that, produce way more pollution. Look at that. And you can see developed countries are still producing pollution, but when you add onto it that extra layer of developing countries producing pollution, now we really begin to crank the whole thing up. And of course, we know one of the results is global warming, which we're seeing kind of in spades in a lot of ways. Now take a look at this graph. It's kind of unusual, but you can handle it. 23 rich, developed countries are responsible for half of all historical emissions. Historical is critical. This means over time, not just today, but over time. And you can see that over time, the United States, number one, 24.6% of historical emissions. Now, if you look at this, you can see that more than 150 countries are responsible for the other half. So in other words, mostly developing countries are creating the other half. I mean, it depends on what you want to consider Ukraine, Russia. And then notice in the upper right-hand corner, international transport is about 2.5%. Most of the ships that move across the ocean and transport our goods are powered by diesel fuel, which is highly polluting. Now look at this. Okay, so first at the top, it's the same kind of color scheme here. So that orangish yellowish color at the top, that represents developed countries, and then the bluish represents developing countries. So population, the developing countries account for about 88% of the population, whereas the developed countries account for about 12%. But notice the 12% in total population accounts for 50% of the historical CO2, carbon dioxide emissions, whereas the other 88% of the population on the planet has accounted for, historically, although this is evolving, the other 50%. 48% plus the international transportation, which is, I guess, on everybody's shoulders. But now look here. Now we see total carbon dioxide emissions in 2020, plus per capita. Per capita means per person in the country. And if you look, who's the leader in CO2 emissions? That is China, because of this massive industrialization that's happened. And while we are number 2, nevertheless, we're not even producing half of the carbon dioxide that China is producing. And notice who's on this list. China, India, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, all developing countries. And then notice over here on the right-hand side, this is per capita. So what you're seeing there is, for example, with the United States, that per capita, per person, we are some of the largest producers of carbon dioxide emissions. But notice who number 1 is. Remember, we have 330 million people. Saudi Arabia is number 1. And Saudi Arabia's population is only about 35 million. We have 330 million, almost 10 times the population. Canada, same amount of emissions as us. Canada has 38 million people in it. Not even close to our population. Australia, more than us. And the Aussies are producing significant amounts of carbon dioxide with only 25 million people. Now you might look at China and say, well, per capita, not too bad. That's true. They produce a lot of emissions, but remember they have 1.4 billion people. So when you spread that amongst the 1.4 billion people, it doesn't come out to be nearly as much. But many people in China still live in very rudimentary ways and don't produce a lot of carbon dioxide. It's in the cities and in the factories where this is overwhelmingly being produced.